He ruled Vienna with fear, until one freezing night his daughter found an angel in the snow, a homeless mother, a crying baby, and the ruthless Mafia boss who had forgotten how to love. But when compassion pulls him into her storm, secrets from the past awaken, his dead wife's shadow, a deadly syndicate, and a love that could cost them everything. Was she his redemption, or the trap that would destroy the Wolf of Vienna forever? Before we dive into today's story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching me from, and what time is it there right now? Snow drifted through the heart of Vienna like falling glass, slicing through the midnight air and painting the city in shades of white silence. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the echo of boots against cobblestone and the distant hum of cathedral bells marking the hour. Lorenzo Volkov, the man the underworld whispered about as the Wolf, moved through that frozen night with the precision of a shadow, his tailored black coat sweeping the wind behind him, his gloved hand wrapped protectively around the small palm of his daughter Sophia. To the world, he was power incarnate, the ruthless king of the city's darkest corners. To Sophia, he was simply Papa, the only warmth she knew in a life guarded by men with guns and ghosts. Her laughter was the only melody that could soften his silence, the only sound that reminded him there was still something innocent in his blood-stained world. Tonight, he had taken her out to see the Christmas lights, an old tradition that Isabella, his late wife, had adored. But now, every flicker of gold reminded him of what he had lost. Every carol felt like a cruel echo of a love stolen by betrayal and death. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, as if trying to bury the sins of Vienna under its quiet white veil. And then, in the hush between footsteps, Sophia's small voice broke the air. "Papa," she whispered, tugging at his coat, "why is that angel sleeping in the snow?" Lorenzo followed her gaze and froze. Near the stone steps of St. Stephen's Cathedral, beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp, a young woman lay curled around a bundle of cloth. Her hair, tangled and dusted with frost, spilled like pale silk over her arms. Her body trembled with exhaustion, and in her arms, a baby whimpered weakly against the cold. For a man like Lorenzo, empathy was a weakness he had trained out of himself long ago. But something in that sight he racked the walls he had built around his heart. Memories surged, Isabella's last breath, the feel of her hand slipping from his, the promise he had broken to protect her. His throat tightened. He approached slowly, the snow crunching beneath his boots, his imposing figure cutting through the night like a dark guardian. The woman stirred, her instincts flaring as she saw him, fear flashing in her eyes. "Don't touch him," she gasped, shielding her baby with trembling arms, her voice roughened by cold and desperation. Lorenzo's gaze softened for the first time in years. "He's dying," he said quietly, kneeling beside her, his voice carrying both authority and something almost gentle. "And so are you." She shook her head, defiant even in weakness, but her lips were blue, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Without hesitation, he removed his cashmere scarf and wrapped it around the child, the fabric swallowing the baby's fragile form. The woman's eyes widened. No one had touched her with such care since before the streets had claimed her. "You come with me," Lorenzo said firmly, standing, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "Or he comes alone." The words cut through the cold, and something in her broke. She nodded silently, clutching the baby as if afraid he might vanish. Sophia stepped closer, her small eyes glimmering with compassion beyond her years. "Papa, can they come home with us?" she asked softly. Lorenzo's chest tightened at her innocence. He gave one curt nod. "Yes, Piccolina, they're coming home." Within minutes, his black sedan pulled up, the air shifting from icy stillness to controlled power as his men stepped aside, their breath fogging the air. Matteo, his loyal consigliere, frowned as the doors opened. "Boss, what is this?" he demanded, eyeing Alara suspiciously. "A risk we cannot afford." Lorenzo shot him a cold look. "They stay," he said, ushering the woman inside. Matteo bit back his protest, recognizing the tone that brooked no argument. Inside the car, the warmth was almost painful after the brutal cold. Alara, he didn't know her name yet, but he, could see the artist's soul in her eyes, held the baby close, rocking him with trembling hands. Her eyes darted around, filled with fear and disbelief, while Sophia watched her silently, as if sensing the invisible thread binding their fates. The drive to the Volkov estate was cloaked in silence, broken only by the baby's soft cries and the rhythmic hum of the engine. Lorenzo stared out the window, his reflection fragmented by passing streetlights, haunted by ghosts he couldn't outrun. He didn't understand why he had acted so impulsively, he, who calculated every move, who trusted no one. But when he looked at Alara and her fragile son, he saw something raw and human, something he thought he had buried with Isabella's coffin. The gates of the Volkov mansion loomed ahead, massive iron guardians opening to reveal a world of shadows and opulence. Inside, the warmth of the grand hall enveloped them. Guards turned their eyes away as Lorenzo led the shivering woman inside, his voice echoing through marble corridors as he ordered the staff to bring blankets and hot water. Matteo followed, his suspicion heavy in the air. "You don't know who she is, Lorenzo," he murmured in Italian. "She could be a trap." Lorenzo didn't look back. "Then she's a brave one to walk into the wolf's den," he replied darkly. The doctor arrived within minutes, examining the baby and assuring Lorenzo that both mother and child would survive the night with warmth and rest. When it was over, Alara sat silently by the fire, eyes fixed on the flames, her body still trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lorenzo turned toward her, his gaze unreadable. "Rest," he said. "You're safe here." The words were strange on his tongue. He hadn't offered safety to anyone in years. Later that night, when the mansion fell into quiet, Lorenzo stood by the doorway of the guest room, watching Alara sleep with her baby nestled in her arms. A faint smile touched Sophia's lips as she peeked from behind him. "She looks like an angel, Papa." Lorenzo didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the woman before him, her face softened by sleep, the firelight tracing the faint bruise along her jaw. Something stirred inside him, something he didn't dare name, and just as he turned away, a flicker of movement caught his eye through the frosted window. A black car parked at the edge of the estate's long driveway, its tinted windows gleaming under the pale moonlight, engine idling, waiting. The wolf's past had come knocking, and this time, it wasn't leaving quietly. Morning crept slowly over Vienna, its pale light slipping through the velvet curtains of the Volkov estate, turning the frost on the windows into patterns that shimmered like fragile lace. Alara stirred beneath silk sheets, the unfamiliar scent of cedar wood and expensive cologne grounding her in a reality she couldn't comprehend. Her eyes fluttered open to gilded walls, soft amber light, and a quiet too heavy to be comforting. For a moment, she forgot the night before. The snow, the cold, the stranger who had carried her from the edge of death. Then memory rushed back like a tide. The man with the gray eyes, the man everyone feared, the wolf. Panic clawed at her chest. She sat up, her breath catching as she saw Luca sleeping beside her, tiny hands gripping her scarf as if it were his whole world. Her body ached, her mind screamed to run, but her heart whispered to stay. She moved to the window, pulling the heavy drapes aside just enough to glimpse the world outside. A courtyard blanketed in white, men in black suits pacing like restless shadows. The mansion wasn't a home. It was a fortress built for war. The door creaked behind her, and Alara spun around, heart leaping. Matteo stepped in, his dark eyes sharp, calculating, his presence carrying the chill of distrust. "You shouldn't wander," he said, his tone clipped, like every word was a test. "This house has eyes, and not all of them are kind." Alara swallowed hard, unsure whether to thank him or defend herself. "I didn't mean to," she murmured, clutching her robe tighter. Matteo studied her, his expression unreadable. "You think kindness comes free here? Whatever reason he brought you, don't mistake it for mercy. Men like Lorenzo don't save, they claim." His words struck like shards of glass, but before she could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor. Sophia appeared, sunlight catching the ribbons in her hair, her smile warm and disarming. "Good morning," the little girl said, tiptoeing inside with the shy grace of a child who knew too much of silence. Alara froze, unsure how to respond, but Sophia's presence was like light through a storm, gentle, persistent. "He's so tiny," Sophia whispered, peering at Luca. "Can I touch him?" Alara hesitated, then nodded. Sophia's fingers brushed Luca's hand, and the baby stirred, his small face scrunching before settling again. The sight brought a tremor to Alara's lips. She hadn't seen anyone look at her son with pure affection since the day he was born. Matteo's scowl deepened, but even he couldn't withstand the softness in Sophia's eyes. "Papa said you're our guest," Sophia added, sitting cross-legged beside the bed. "He said you were cold, so we gave you our warmest blankets. Do you like hot chocolate? I'll tell Maria to make some." Before Alara could respond, Sophia had already dashed out, leaving the air lighter than it had been moments before. Matteo muttered something under his breath in Italian and left her alone, though his parting glance lingered with unspoken warning. Alara sank back against the bedpost, exhaling shakily. She didn't know what kind of world she had stumbled into, but she knew she was no longer invisible. Downstairs, Lorenzo stood by the grand piano in the foyer, his reflection fractured across the polished black surface. He hadn't slept, not since the night he'd found her. The wolf who once commanded empires now stood haunted by the image of a woman shivering in the snow. He told himself it was guilt, a meaningless act of conscience, yet her face lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't silence. When Matteo entered, Lorenzo didn't turn. "Is she awake?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Matteo replied, "and already curious about the cage she's in." Lorenzo's jaw tensed. "She's not a prisoner." Matteo gave a dry chuckle. "No? Then why the guards outside her door?" Lorenzo said nothing. His eyes drifted to the snow-covered gardens, where Sophia was now leading Alara toward the fountain, Luca cradled in her arms. Alara's steps were cautious but graceful, her eyes scanning the statues and towering hedges as if each corner whispered a secret. Sophia skipped ahead, giggling as snowflakes landed on her nose. For a moment, Lorenzo allowed himself to watch. He saw Alara tilt her head toward the sky, saw the way the light brushed against her pale hair, and something inside him stirred. A dangerous longing for normalcy, for something untainted. Isabella's memory haunted him still, but it didn't ache with rage now. It ached with guilt, with the realization that he had buried his heart beside her grave, and yet this woman, this fragile stranger, had breathed life into the ashes. Later, when he finally approached her, Alara turned sharply, startled by the sound of his footsteps. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, her voice trembling despite the effort to appear composed. Lorenzo studied her, the winter light reflecting off his eyes like cold steel. "You're not intruding," he replied. "You're recovering," she frowned. "I can't stay here forever." "No," he said simply. "But for now, this is the safest place in Vienna." His tone carried weight, something protective yet possessive. "The world out there won't be kind to a woman with a child, and no name." The words stung because they were true. "Then I'll find my own way," she whispered, meeting his gaze with defiance. He stepped closer, close enough for her to see the scar along his jaw, a reminder of battles fought long before her time. "You survived the cold," he murmured. "That earns you more than pity." The air between them tightened. For a moment, silence hung heavy, charged with something that felt dangerous. Neither of them fully understood what it was, only that it was alive. That evening, Sophia insisted Alara join them for dinner. The table stretched long and gleaming, candles flickering against crystal glassware. Alara felt misplaced among the polished silver and quiet authority of men who bowed to Lorenzo without words. Yet when Sophia giggled, feeding bits of bread to Luca, laughter filled the room for the first time in years. Even Lorenzo's lips curved faintly, though he quickly hid it behind his wine glass. To everyone else, he was the untouchable wolf. To Sophia, he was just a man trying to remember how to smile. But Matteo, seated across the table, didn't share the sentiment. His sharp gaze flicked between Alara and his boss, suspicion burning like acid. After dinner, while Lorenzo tucked Sofia into bed, Matteo slipped into his office. The glow from the computer cast eerie shadows over his face as he examined the documents Lorenzo had ordered for Alara's stay. Medical reports, ID papers, birth records. One file caught his attention, her identification card. He zoomed in, eyes narrowing at the emblem faintly watermarked on the corner, an insignia used by the rival Krogan Syndicate's forgers. His pulse quickened. Either this woman was hiding from them, or she was one of them. And if she was, the wolf had just invited his enemy straight into his home. Matteo grabbed the file and stormed down the corridor toward Lorenzo's study, his footsteps echoing through marble halls like gunfire. Lorenzo was standing by the fireplace when Matteo entered, the flames dancing across his face. "What is it?" Lorenzo asked, his tone calm, but edged with and Matteo tossed the document onto the desk. "She's not who she says she is," he said coldly. "Her ID? It's fake, and it's tied to Krogan territory." Lorenzo's eyes darkened as the fire crackled between them. He didn't know whether the angel he'd saved was a blessing, or the devil sent to destroy him. The air inside the Volkov estate had changed, thicker, heavier, charged with invisible tension that clung to every breath Alara took. She could feel it the moment she stepped into the grand hall that morning, the way the guards' eyes followed her every move, the way conversations hushed when she entered. Even Sofia's laughter, usually bright as sunlight, seemed quieter, dulled by the unease that had begun to coil through the marble corridors like unseen smoke. Lorenzo had grown colder since last night. His once curious gaze had hardened into calculation. Each glance toward her now weighed and dissected, as though he were trying to read a confession written on her skin. He sat at the head of the long oak table during breakfast, black suit immaculate, eyes like frozen fire as he stirred his espresso without drinking it. Matteo stood behind him, expression unreadable but satisfied, as if his warning had sunk its teeth deep into the wolf's mind. "You have a false name," Matteo had told him, "and that, my friend, is never coincidence." Alara didn't understand what was happening, only that the warmth she had begun to feel here was slipping away, replaced by suspicion sharp enough to draw blood. "You think I'm lying," she said softly, clutching her cup with trembling fingers. "You think I came here with some hidden plan." Lorenzo didn't look at her immediately. When he did, his stare was so controlled it frightened her more than any shout could have. "I think," he said finally, his tone a dangerous calm, "that no one ends up outside my gates by accident." His words cut deeper than Ani realized. She wanted to scream that she hadn't planned any of this, that she was only a woman trying to keep her child alive, but her pride refused to beg. Instead, she lifted her chin and said, "If you truly believe I'm a threat, then throw me out. I've survived worse than your suspicion." The defiance in her voice startled even her. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking briefly to baby Luca sleeping in the cradle near the window. The sight disarmed him for just a heartbeat. That tiny chest rising and falling, those impossibly small hands, it stirred something buried deep beneath layers of steel and control, something human. "You speak boldly for someone under my roof," he said, but his voice had softened, the threat blurred by confusion. She met his eyes. "Because I've learned that silence doesn't save you, Mr. Volkov. It only buries you slower." There was no tremor in her tone, only quiet truth, and for the first time, Lorenzo looked at her not as a possible enemy, but as a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. The day passed in uneasy stillness. Sofia, unaware of the undercurrent swirling around her, insisted Alara and Luca join her for lunch in the garden conservatory. The child's laughter broke through the coldness like sunlight filtering through clouds, and Alara, touched by her innocence, found herself smiling again. She taught Sofia how to fold paper birds, her fingers moving with delicate care, while Luca slept peacefully in a bassinet beside them. From the balcony above, Lorenzo watched, unseen, his heart in quiet conflict. He had buried his emotions years ago after Isabella's death. Grief had hardened into cruelty, and tenderness had been banished from his world. Yet here was this stranger, weaving it back into his home, into his daughter's laughter, into the very air he breathed. He didn't like the feeling of vulnerability clawing at him, didn't like how easily she stirred something he thought long dead. And still, he couldn't look away. Mateo's words echoed in his mind. She's not who she says she is. It was a warning, yes, but also an excuse to retreat from what scared him most. Still, he tested her subtly, asking questions with hidden traps. "You said you were from Graz," he remarked casually one evening as he poured himself whiskey. "What part?" She blinked, startled by the sudden interrogation. "Near Jakominiplatz," she answered hesitantly. His eyebrow twitched. "Interesting, because the ID you gave says Salzburg." The lie she hadn't even known was there hung in the air between them like a blade. I didn't falsify anything," she stammered. "That ID was given to me after I was evicted. My landlord took everything. I had to get another. Someone helped me." She trailed off, realizing how desperate it sounded. "Someone?" Lorenzo asked sharply. "Who?" "A priest," she whispered. "At a shelter." It wasn't enough to convince him, but it wasn't quite a lie either. That night, when the mansion had grown quiet and the snow pressed against the windows, Ilara found herself unable to sleep. Fear had coiled in her stomach, but so had something else, a stubborn urge to prove she didn't belong to whatever dark world they thought she came from. She wandered into the old art studio at the far end of the hall, its walls lined with canvases left untouched since Isabella's death. The faint scent of turpentine still lingered, and for a moment she felt an echo of the woman whose presence still haunted this house. Taking up a brush, she began to paint, not out of obligation, but out of need. Her hand moved instinctively, strokes flowing like whispers, colors bleeding together under the soft lamplight. Slowly, shapes emerged. Sophia's bright eyes, her gentle smile. Luca's tiny face beside her, peaceful and safe. It was a scene of innocence untouched by the world's cruelty. Hours passed unnoticed. She painted until her fingers trembled and tears blurred her vision. When she finally stepped back, she saw not just two children, but a glee, MPs of the family she never had. She didn't hear the door open. Lorenzo stood silently in the threshold, watching her. The glow of the lamp cast a halo around her figure, her golden hair loose, her face softened by exhaustion and light. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. The painting captivated him, not because of its beauty, but because of something in the background. Behind the children, almost hidden in shadow, she had unconsciously painted the outline of a wrought iron gate with a single ivy branch curling around it. His pulse quickened. He knew that gate. It was from the villa where Isabella had died. The same mark, those curling vines, was etched into the old stone pillar at the scene. Lorenzo's expression darkened. How could she have painted something she'd never seen? His mind raced, suspicion twisting into dread. "Where did you see that gate?" he demanded suddenly, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. Ilara spun around, startled, eyes wide. "What?" "The gate," he said, stepping closer, his presence filling the room. "Where did you see it?" She looked at the painting, confusion knitting her brow. I don't know," she stammered. "It just came out. I paint what I feel, not what I know." Her answer only deepened the mystery. He moved closer still, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of whiskey and cedar on his skin. "You expect me to believe that?" he said quietly, dangerously. Her heart pounded. "Believe what you want," she whispered, "but I don't know what that place is." He searched her eyes, looking for deception and finding only fear, and something rawer beneath it, something that mirrored his own confusion. He wanted to step back, to regain control, but his body betrayed him, leaning closer instead. For one suspended heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. The snow, the silence, the danger, all faded. Only the storm between them remained. Lorenzo's phone buzzed sharply in the tense quiet. Mateo's voice crackled through. "Boss, we've got a problem. The Krogan Syndicate just sent us a message." An image of that same gate, with today's date carved beneath it. The firelight trembled against the walls of the Volkov estate as Lorenzo stood frozen before the painting, his gaze locked on the faint, unmistakable mark. the same carved insignia that had once stained the marble floor where Isabella had drawn her last breath. The air thickened with old ghosts and unanswered questions, and when he turned to Alara, there was a storm in his eyes that could shatter stone. "Where did you see this symbol?" he demanded, his voice low but edged with something volatile. Alara blinked, confusion flooding her face, her fingers still streaked with paint. "It was just part of the background. I didn't know it meant anything." Her voice trembled, not from guilt, but from the weight of being seen as something she was not. Lorenzo took a step closer, his presence suffocating yet magnetic, his hands slamming onto the table beside her as the canvas rattled between them. "Don't lie to me," he growled, his shadow swallowing hers. Alara flinched, then steadied herself, her eyes fierce through tears. "I don't even know your wife," she shot back, "but maybe if you stopped chasing ghosts, you'd see the living right in front of you." Her words cut through the cold like glass, stunning him into silence. For a moment, he saw her, not as a threat, not as a mystery, but as a mirror reflecting his own torment. Before he could answer, a fragile voice echoed down the hall. "Papa." Sophia's small figure appeared, her cheeks pale, her steps unsteady. The argument vanished instantly. Lorenzo's entire being shifted from wrath to fear as he swept his daughter into his arms, feeling the unnatural heat against her forehead. "Matteo!" he roared, his command sharp as a gunshot. "Call the doctor! Now!" Alara's instincts overtook her fear. She rushed to prepare cold compresses, her hands trembling as she whispered "Laonte," reassurances to the child who clung weakly to her. Lorenzo watched, helpless for the first time in years, as Alara cared for Sophia with the tenderness of a mother, her movements swift, her voice gentle, her eyes never leaving the little girl's. Time blurred into heartbeats, into soft cries and murmured prayers, and in that dim room scented with medicine and fear, the Mafia boss found himself kneeling beside the very woman he had just accused. "She'll be okay," Alara whispered, brushing Sophia's damp hair from her face. "She's strong, like you." The quiet words, simple yet sincere, pierced the ice that had encased Lorenzo's heart since Isabella's death. He didn't speak, but his gaze softened, following every motion of Alara's hands, the way she held Sophia as though the child were her own. Hours passed, the storm outside lashing against the windows, and for the first time, Lorenzo allowed someone else to share the silence that haunted him. When the doctor finally arrived, he confirmed what they feared but expected. Sophia's fever was high but manageable. Exhaustion and the cold had weakened her. Relief washed through the room like sunlight through a crack in a tomb. Alara exhaled shakily, slumping into the nearest chair, her head in her hands, unaware of the man watching her with a gaze that had shifted from suspicion to something far more dangerous, longing. In the hush that followed, Lorenzo poured 2 glasses of water, his hands steady now, the adrenaline fading but his mind far from calm. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing, and that brief contact sparked something electric. "You didn't have to stay," he murmured, his tone quieter than it had been in years. "But you did." Alara looked up, her lashes wet, her voice hoarse. "Because no one should face pain alone." The words undid him in ways bullets never could. He turned away, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace, remembering Isabella's laughter, her warmth, her betrayal, or what he thought was betrayal. He could almost hear her voice whispering through the firelight, asking him to let go. When he looked back, Alara was leaning over Sophia's bed, humming softly, a lullaby that stirred fragments of his past. Something fragile broke loose inside him, and before he could stop himself, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. The world seemed to narrow to that single heartbeat, her startled eyes meeting his, the firelight flickering between them, the sound of his breath mingling with hers. "You shouldn't look at me like that," she whispered, her tone trembling between fear and desire. "And yet," he said quietly, "I can't seem to stop." It wasn't love, not yet, but something wild and aching, a dangerous connection forged in the crucible of shared pain. He stepped closer, his voice low, confessional. Isabella died because I trusted the wrong person. I won't make that mistake again. Elara met his gaze, defiant and trembling. Then stop looking for the past in me, she said. I'm not her ghost. For a moment, the air crackled with unspoken emotion. Grief, guilt, temptation. Then Sophia stirred, breaking the spell. Elara turned back to the child, but Lorenzo lingered, his jaw clenched, his pulse unsteady. He felt something shifting inside him, something terrifying, the beginning of wanting again. Outside, the storm quieted, but a deeper storm brewed within the walls of the Volkov estate. Matteo stood at the entrance, scanning the snow-laden grounds through the flicker of security lights, his instincts restless. He had seen the way Lorenzo looked at her, and it scared him more than any rival syndicate. Love made men weak, and weakness got them killed. He was about to turn back when movement caught his eye, a glint on the hill beyond the gate, a reflection where there should have been none. He froze, adrenaline flaring, hand reaching for his gun as his earpiece crackled. "Boss!" His voice was tight, urgent. "We've got a problem." Matteo's voice trembled as he stepped into the light. "Boss, sniper spotted outside the estate." The night erupted in chaos before dawn could whisper its warning. 1 second, the world outside the Volkov estate was silent, blanketed in snow. The next, it was splintered by the sharp crack of gunfire that tore through the stillness like a scream. Matteo's shout echoed through the hallways as security lights flared red, casting violent shadows on the marble floors. Lorenzo was already moving, a predator awakened, his instincts sharper than the bullets tearing through the air. "Elara, get down!" he roared, dragging her to the ground as glass exploded above them in a rain of glittering shards. The weight of his body shielded hers, the scent of gunpowder mixing with fear and adrenaline. Elara clutched Luca to her chest, trembling as his cries pierced the din. Sophia's terrified sobs echoed from down the corridor, and that sound, his daughter's, snapped something raw and ancient inside Lorenzo. He rose with the fury of a man who had lost too much already, grabbing the nearest gun from a fallen guard, his black coat whipping behind him as he stormed into the chaos. The night became a blur of muzzle flashes, shouted orders, and the sharp, metallic scent of blood in the snow. Elara crawled to the corner, shielding Luca, her heart pounding with terror and disbelief. The world she had stumbled into was a war zone, and the man who had saved her was now a dark angel of death. She saw him through the shattered window, his silhouette framed by firelight, precise and unrelenting as he moved through the intruders with cold efficiency. The wolf was no longer a legend whispered in fear. He was real, terrifyingly alive, and unstoppable. Matteo appeared beside him, barking orders, his own weapons spitting fire as they pushed back the attackers. "They breached the north gate," Matteo yelled. "We've got at least 6 inside." "Not for long," Lorenzo growled, eyes burning like stormfire. The last man standing tried to flee across the courtyard, but Lorenzo caught him by the collar, slamming him into the snow, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice low, lethal. The man coughed, choking on blood. "The girl," he rasped. "The girl was bait. Someone wanted you to bring her in." For a moment, everything stopped. The wind howled through the courtyard as Lorenzo's expression froze into stone, the words sinking like ice through his veins. He tightened his grip until the man gasped, then released him to Matteo. "Get him inside," Lorenzo ordered, his tone unreadable. He turned toward the shattered front doors, his mind racing through possibilities, betrayal, coincidence, or the cruel twist of fate that always seemed to follow him. Inside, Elara sat in the corner of the grand hall, holding Luca close, tears streaking her face. Her clothes were torn, her knuckles scraped, but her eyes, those eyes, still burned with defiance. When Lorenzo entered, blood smeared across his jaw. She looked at him not as a savior, not as a monster, but as both. "They came for you," she whispered. Because of me? He said nothing at first, only watched her, breathing hard, his chest heaving beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Matteo shoved the captured assassin into a chair, forcing him to repeat the confession. She was the bait, the man said again, voice breaking. We were told he'd take the girl in, that's when we'd strike. Who gave the order? Matteo snapped, but the man's eyes rolled back before he could speak, poison foaming at his lips. Silence followed, heavy, suffocating. The storm outside had ceased, but inside, a darker one brewed between them. Lorenzo's gaze drifted back to Ilara. Every instinct screamed not to trust her, yet something inside him refused to believe she was capable of deceit. I didn't know, she whispered, voice trembling. I swear I didn't. He studied her, eyes narrowing, torn between logic and something far more dangerous. Emotion. She looked broken, yet unyielding, fragile, yet radiant in the dim light. Luca whimpered, and she rocked him gently, her love for the child so real it silenced even Matteo's suspicions for a moment. Boss, Matteo said quietly. It could still be true. Maybe she was used. Maybe she doesn't even know by who. But Lorenzo barely heard him. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of Ilara's breathing and the echo of the gunfire fading beyond the walls. Blood stained the snow outside, but in here, another kind of war had begun, one fought not with bullets, but with trust and doubt. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, his boots crunching on broken glass. Every time I trust someone, he said softly, almost to himself, I end up burying them. Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. Then don't trust me, she said. Just see me. That single line, raw and honest, hit him harder than any bullet. Matteo looked away, sensing the tension thickening like smoke. The guards were sweeping the grounds, sirens wailing faintly in the distance, and the glow of emergency lights bathed the estate in eerie red. Lorenzo exhaled slowly, running a blood-stained hand through his hair, torn between fury and something deeper, a pull he couldn't shake. He walked past her, then stopped, turning back just enough for the firelight to catch his eyes. As police sirens faded into the night, Lorenzo turned to Ilara, blood dripping from his fingers, his voice low and cold. Who are you really, Ilara? The night still smelled of gunpowder and snow when Lorenzo's words cut through the silence like a blade. Who are you really, Ilara? The room trembled with tension, and her hands, trembling and cold, clutched at the edge of her torn shawl as if the fabric could shield her from the truth pressing against her chest. The flickering fire threw shadows across his face, highlighting the fury, confusion, and the faint trace of something deeper, betrayal laced with reluctant care. Ilara's lips parted, but no words came. Luca whimpered softly. In the corner, his tiny hand reaching for her, grounding her when her mind threatened to shatter under the weight of the moment. Matteo stood by the door, his pistol low but ready, eyes sharp as steel, ready to act if the boss gave even the smallest command. The silence thickened until it almost suffocated them all. Finally, with a trembling breath, Ilara whispered, You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Lorenzo took a step forward, his boots crushing broken glass on the floor, his eyes burning with icy fire. Try me. The words cracked her open. Tears streaked down her soot-stained face as memories surged like a storm she could no longer contain. My father, she began, voice trembling, worked for the Krogans. He wasn't just a man in their circle. He was one of their masterminds. Until he betrayed them. Her voice broke. He stole their money, millions, and disappeared. I was 16 when they came for me. They burned our home to the ground. I lost everything that night. My mother, my brother, and I've been running ever since. Her knees buckled, and Lorenzo caught her before she hit the floor. His grip was strong, steady, too steady for a man who lived his life in chaos. So they came for you tonight, he murmured, piecing it together. They used you as bait, hoping I'd take you in. She nodded weakly. They knew you'd help someone in the cold. They knew you'd still have a heart left. no matter how much you tried to bury it. Lorenzo froze. The words sliced into him with brutal precision, unearthing ghosts he had buried with his wife, Isabella. For years, he'd lived by one rule: trust no one. But now, staring into Alara's tearful eyes, he saw something raw, uncalculated, painfully real. He saw fear, but also strength, the kind that only came from surviving the impossible. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "Because," she whispered, "people who learn the truth about me don't live long enough to regret it." The honesty in her tone broke something inside him. For once, Lorenzo didn't see her as a threat or a pawn in someone else's game. He saw her as a woman standing at the edge of destruction, fighting for the smallest piece of peace she could find. Matteo cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Boss, this could be a trap." "Enough," Lorenzo snapped, his voice sharp as glass. Matteo's eyes narrowed, but he obeyed, stepping back into the dim hall. The fire crackled. The air grew heavier, charged with something deeper than fear, an energy that pulsed between them, raw and dangerous. Elara wiped her tears, trying to compose herself, but her hands betrayed her, shaking uncontrollably. "You should hate me," she said. "You should throw me out." Lorenzo's voice was low, almost a growl. "I should, but I don't." He turned away, pacing near the fire, running a hand through his dark hair, battling the war inside him. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, but her scent, her voice, her eyes, they pulled him closer. "You remind me of someone," he admitted finally, glancing back at her. "Someone I swore I'd never forget." Alara swallowed hard. "Your wife?" He nodded once, eyes clouded with grief. "She had your fire, that same refusal to break, even when the world tried to crush her." A silence lingered, fragile and heavy. Then, as if pulled by gravity itself, they found each other in the middle of the room. Her breath hitched as his hand brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, hesitant, so unlike the ruthless man the world feared. Alara's pulse quickened. "Lorenzo?" she whispered, unsure if she was asking him to stop or begging him not to. But his restraint shattered the moment her tears fell again. He wiped one away with his thumb, his gaze locking with hers. "You've been running long enough," he said softly. "Let someone fight for you for once." The confession turned into something wordless. A tension that neither of them could name pulled them together until there was no space left between fear and longing. The world outside was silent, the storm easing, but inside, another kind of storm raged, a desperate, dark collision of grief and desire. When his lips met hers, it wasn't gentle. It was broken and hungry, full of all the things they'd both lost. She responded like someone who hadn't been touched by kindness in years, trembling under the weight of emotions too deep to name. The fire roared beside them, painting their silhouettes against the walls, two souls bound by pain, finding solace in the wreckage of their scars. Time dissolved. The mansion felt alive, breathing with the ghosts of the past and the heartbeat of something new. Outside, snow fell softly against the windows, as if the world itself wanted to hush their sins. Later, when the night deepened and exhaustion took them, Elara lay curled beside him, her fingers tracing the scar along his chest, the one over his heart. "What happened here?" she whispered. Lorenzo stared at the ceiling for a long time before answering. "A bullet meant for someone I loved." She pressed her palm over it gently. Then maybe it's time it started healing. For the first time in years, Lorenzo closed his eyes without the usual darkness clawing at his mind. But peace, in his world, was never meant to last. The dawn crept in slowly, the pale light of morning sneaking through the curtains. Elara stirred, the scent of smoke and his cologne still clinging to her skin. She reached across the bed, but it was empty. Panic surged. "Lorenzo?" she called softly, sitting up, the sheets falling around her. No answer. The fire had burned low, the air chilling once more. She pulled his shirt over her shoulders and stepped into the hall, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. That's when she saw him, or rather, saw who was waiting in his place. Matteo stood by the doorway, his expression carved from stone, eyes unreadable. In his hand, he held Lorenzo's gun. "Where is he?" she asked, voice trembling. Matteo tilted his head, lips curving into a faint, cold smile. "Gone." "Gone where?" she whispered. His answer was a dagger dipped in ice. "You shouldn't have trusted the wolf." Alara's breath caught as she glanced past Matteo's shoulder and froze. The front door of the estate stood wide open, snowy footprints leading out into the white dawn, and among them, a single crimson trail of blood. The morning air was thick with frost, a pale silence stretching across the Volkov estate, like the calm before a storm. Alara awoke to the cold emptiness beside her, Lorenzo's scent fading from the sheets like a ghost. The night before still burned behind her eyelids. The trembling confessions, the tears that mingled with kisses, the way his darkness met her fear and turned it into something fragile and real. But now the warmth was gone, replaced by the figure in the doorway, Matteo, his expression a storm of distrust and resolve. "You shouldn't have trusted the wolf," he said, his tone more like a sentence than advice. Panic flared in her chest as she gathered Luca, whose tiny fingers reached for her face. "Where is he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Matteo's jaw clenched. "Handling business. You're coming with me. It's not safe here anymore." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Alara, still shaken from the chaos and her confession, followed him through the maze-like corridors of marble and shadow, the echoes of their footsteps the only sound in the grand silence of the mansion. Outside, the snow had returned, silent, relentless, the kind that buried everything it touched. A black SUV waited, idling with exhaust swirling into the freezing air. Matteo opened the door for her, his sharp gaze scanning every rooftop, every glint of light in the distance. "No one can know where you're going," he murmured. "The Krogans have eyes everywhere." Alara held Luca tighter, her pulse quickening. "Does Lorenzo know?" Matteo hesitated, then shut the door without answering. The drive was long, winding through narrow mountain roads where the city lights gave way to forests cloaked in darkness. The safe house appeared at last, a small, nondescript cabin buried under layers of snow, its isolation both a comfort and a curse. Inside, Matteo checked every lock, every window, before finally exhaling. "You'll stay here until I hear from Lorenzo. Don't open the door for anyone." His words carried both protection and warning. When he turned to leave, Alara reached out, her voice breaking. "Do you really think I'd hurt him? I never wanted any of this." Matteo's expression softened for a moment. "Not enough to trust, but enough to understand. That's what scares me," he said quietly, before disappearing into the night. Hours passed in tense silence. Alara rocked Luca to sleep, humming softly, her eyes darting to the flickering shadows cast by the fireplace. Each creak of the wooden floorboards made her heart lurch. The storm outside grew violent, the wind howling like the ghosts of all the lives the Mafia had claimed. Somewhere between exhaustion and fear, she whispered, "We'll be okay, my love," as if saying it enough times could make it true. But fate had other plans. The faint sound of tires crunching over ice reached her ears, too deliberate, too heavy. Her heart stopped. She peeked through the frost-covered window and froze. 3 men emerged from the darkness, their coats marked with the Krogan insignia, black wolves devouring a crimson sun. Panic surged through her veins. She backed away, clutching Luca as a knock thundered against the door. "Matteo?" she whispered hopefully. Then came the second knock, harder, angrier. "Open up, Alara," a voice hissed. "We know you're in there." She stumbled back, her breath trembling, searching for anything, a weapon, a phone, a miracle. The window shattered an instant later, shards of glass raining down as masked men stormed in. Alara screamed, shielding Luca with her body as bullets tore into the wooden walls. She darted behind the couch, crawling toward the back door, her lungs burning with terror. One of the men grabbed her by the wrist. She slashed at him with a shard of broken glass, cutting deep enough to make him roar in pain. "You should have stayed in the snow where we found you." Another growled, raising his gun. A single gunshot cracked through the night, but it wasn't his. Matteo appeared in the doorway, weapon blazing, taking down 2 men in seconds. "Go," he shouted, his voice raw. "Run, Ilara!" She clutched Luca and stumbled out into the storm, her bare feet sinking into the freezing snow. Behind her, chaos exploded. Gunfire, shouting, the metallic tang of blood and smoke filling the air. She looked back just once and saw Matteo pinned by one of the attackers. "Lorenzo's coming!" he shouted before a deafening explosion consumed the cabin in flames. Ilara screamed, the shockwave knocking her off her feet, snow and fire swirling together in a nightmarish dance. When the roaring finally subsided, all that remained was ruin. Flames licking at the sky, smoke curling into the storm. At that same moment, far across the city, Lorenzo's phone rang. Matteo's emergency code. His heart dropped as he heard only static and one fragmented word. Safe house. Without hesitation, he was already in motion, storming through the garage, shouting orders. "Gear up! We move now!" His men scrambled as engines roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. The convoy tore through the snow-laden streets, his grip white-knuckled on the steering wheel, eyes burning with fury and fear. He had already lost 1 woman to violence. He would not lose another. The drive felt endless, each second a hammer against his chest. By the time he reached the outskirts, the smell of burning wood filled the air. Flames devoured what remained of the cabin, sparks scattering into the wind like dying stars. "No." Lorenzo staggered forward, ignoring Matteo's bloodied men trying to restrain him. "Ilara!" he roared, his voice breaking, echoing through the snow-drenched silence. "Ilara!" He fell to his knees, the fire reflecting in his eyes like hell itself, smoke and grief blurring together until everything felt unreal. The snow beneath him turned red from the blood dripping off his hands, a haunting reminder of all he'd failed to protect. For the first time in years, the wolf looked broken. A man consumed by loss, by guilt, by love that had come too late. His heart clenched when he heard it, faint, fragile, barely audible. A baby's cry. Through the thick smoke and swirling ash, Lorenzo froze. Luca's wail pierced the silence, small, alive, desperate. He stumbled toward the sound, voice shaking. "Ilara, where are you?" But as the smoke parted, there was no sign of her, only the child lying in the snow, and her scarf, half burned, fluttering in the wind. The snow had begun to melt, leaving Vienna a bleak wash of gray and ice, but Lorenzo Volkov's world remained frozen in time, a nightmarish stillness that refused to release him. Days had passed since the explosion, each one stretching endlessly, each one filled with the hollow echo of Ilara's absence and Luca's cries still haunting him in his dreams. He moved like a ghost through his mansion, walls echoing with silence, Matteo trailing silently behind, every muscle in his body taut with rage and desperation. The wolf had become a creature of obsession. His empire, once built on power and fear, now existed only to serve a singular purpose: finding Ilara. His phone was constantly alive with intel, tips, rumors, and threats, yet every lead ended in dead ends. Every whisper seemed tainted by Krogan's deceit. Sophia, his small daughter, would kneel each night by her window, hands clasped tightly, eyes squeezed shut, whispering prayers into the cold night. "Papa, save her. She's our angel." Lorenzo could hear her, soft voice in his mind during meetings with syndicate heads, during planning sessions, even in the midst of violent takedowns, her innocence a blade cutting through the armor he wore like skin. Matteo, ever vigilant, had uncovered the first shred of truth that gave Lorenzo both hope and dread. Ilara was alive. The Krogans had taken her, not destroyed her, and now she was being used, a living lure, to draw the wolf into their trap. The news ignited a storm inside him, fury, fear, and an almost unbearable longing that twisted in his chest like fire. He paced his private study, black coat flaring behind him with each sharp turn, eyes burning with a mixture of grief and raw desire to punish those who had dared to harm the woman he had come to claim as more than just a survivor, a piece of his fractured soul. Each minute wasted was a torment. Each second that she remained in their hands was a betrayal of everything he had built, every life he had protected, every rule he had lived by. His mind replayed the last moments he had seen her, the way she had held Luca close, trembling, desperate, yet unbroken. That defiance, that courage, had stirred something within him deeper than lust or affection. It was the spark of redemption, the possibility of reclaiming a humanity long buried beneath the wolf's ruthless exterior. He could see her, hear her, smell the faint trace of lavender from her hair, the warmth of her small body pressed to his in the moments before the Krogans had struck. Each memory was a knife, twisting in his chest, forcing him to move faster, strike harder, be smarter than anyone he had ever faced. He called in every favor, every connection, the underworld bending and breaking under the weight of his obsession. Tips came from street informants, corrupt officials, even rival families, all fearing the wrath of the wolf unleashed on anyone who dared touch the woman and child under his protection. Meanwhile, Ilara's own battle raged in the shadows of her captivity. Bruised, bloodied, yet defiant, she clutched Luca to her chest, whispering promises she barely dared to believe herself. Each time a Krogan approached, she flinched and then lashed out with whatever she could grab: splintered wood, broken chains, shards of metal, defending the child who had become the center of her world. They underestimated her, thinking she was weak because of her situation, but Ilara had learned to survive, to fight, to protect with every ounce of her being. She had been taught that the wolf was coming for her, that he would find them, and it was this faith that steadied her hands and sharpened her mind. She had heard the whispers of the Krogans' plans, how they intended to bait Lorenzo, how they had calculated every move to force him into a trap where his fury would be useless. And yet she refused to be broken. Inside, every scream of Luca's protest, every tear she shed, every moment of pain was a testament to her resilience. Back in Vienna, Lorenzo studied every photograph, every map, every hint of the Krogans' movements with a precision that bordered on obsession. He barely ate, barely slept, barely spoke except to issue orders to his men. His mind was a storm of strategy and vengeance, of love and rage, each thought consumed by the single goal: rescuing Ilara and Luca before it was too late. Even Sophia's innocent prayers were etched into his consciousness, a compass guiding him through the labyrinth of danger. Then, when he felt the weight of despair pressing on his chest, a vibration cut through the tension. A message on his secure line. He snatched the phone, hands trembling with anticipation and dread. The screen lit up with a photo that made his blood run cold. Ilara, bruised, tied to a chair, hair matted, eyes defiant despite the pain. Luca was cradled close to her, and above the image, a single message typed in bold letters that sent a chill down his spine: "Come alone, or the baby dies." Lorenzo's chest tightened, rage and fear colliding in an explosive mix. Every instinct screamed, every rule he had ever lived by shattered. He stared at the screen. The image of her suffering burned into his mind, her defiance, her courage, her beauty, all wrapped in chains and danger. He pressed a hand to his face, closing his eyes briefly, drawing in a single breath before his lips curved into the wolf's familiar smirk. One tinged with vengeance, one promising a storm the Krogans had no idea was coming. Lorenzo's voice dropped to a deadly whisper as he stared at the message. "If they hurt her, I'll tear everything down to the ground." Outside, Vienna slept, oblivious, while somewhere in the shadows, the Krogans waited, and the wolf was already hunting. Lorenzo's boots pounded against the icy pavement, each step fueled by a storm that had long been brewing within him. A mixture of fury, fear, and the unyielding, desperate love that no amount of power or money could ever quell. The message on his phone burned in his mind: Ilara bruised, tied, a fragile angel with Luca trembling in her arms, and the words that threatened to shatter everything he held sacred. "Come alone, or the baby dies." He ignored the cries of his men, the protests of Matteo over the secure line, the warnings of every street informant who begged him to wait. Nothing mattered except reaching her before the Krogans could harm her or his child. Snow swirled in the cold night, whipping against his tailored black coat, sticking to the steel resolve etched into every line of his face, every muscle coiled and ready. He reached the Krogan headquarters, a fortress of concrete and iron, a place built to intimidate even the most fearless. But fear had long left Lorenzo. It was replaced by a primal, unrelenting wrath. The first guard went down without hesitation, a clean shot from his pistol, and the wolf moved like a shadow, silent yet unstoppable. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, flames erupted from scattered explosions, and chaos consumed the night. Inside, the corridors smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and the faint metallic tan of blood, but he barely registered it. Every sound was a heartbeat, every step a promise that he would reach her. Then he saw her, Elara, battered and bruised, but defiant, cradling Luca tightly, her body a shield, her eyes burning with the courage he had come to love. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and terror, whispering his name as the world exploded around them. Lorenzo. Her voice broke through the storm of violence like sunlight through a storm cloud. He reached her just as another gunman raised a weapon. Instinct, fury, and training moving as one. He fired, taking down the man in a heartbeat, but not before a bullet tore into his side. Pain lanced through him, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he swept Elara and Luca into his arms, collapsing beside them as the adrenaline slowly drained, leaving raw, searing pain in its place. "It's over," he murmured, though his voice trembled with both relief and agony. Elara pressed herself against him, her own injuries forgotten in the warmth and protection of his body, tears mingling with blood, snow, and smoke. Matteo arrived moments later, reinforcements in tow, guns blazing, clearing the remaining threats with precise efficiency, his face pale with relief as he saw his boss alive, holding the two most precious beings in his life. Lorenzo's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, every heartbeat a reminder of what he had risked, of the life he had reclaimed from the jaws of death. He looked down at Elara, her face streaked with soot and tears, yet radiant with resilience. "You made me human again," he whispered, voice hoarse, fragile, almost afraid to break the spell of this moment. Elara, exhausted, barely conscious, placed a trembling hand over his, her fingers seeking warmth, life, and a promise that the world they had fought to survive together was still theirs to claim. Snow and rain mixed with the sea, oot from the burning building outside, painting a chaotic masterpiece of destruction and salvation. Sirens approached, a reminder that the outside world would soon descend upon them. But Lorenzo did not move from their little corner of fragile safety. Luca stirred in her arms, cooing softly, and Elara smiled faintly, exhausted yet triumphant, as if the battle had only made their bond stronger. He traced the line of her jaw, his fingers lingering, memorizing, as if he could imprint her onto his very soul. Every scar, every bruise, every defiant spark in her eyes called to something primal in him, something he had lost the day Isabella died. For the first time, he felt the weight of grief lighten, replaced by a need to protect, to cherish, and to love without restraint. The chaos of the Krogan headquarters faded into background noise, the smoke curling like serpents above them, and Lorenzo allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, pressing his forehead against hers. "Never again," he whispered, a promise to the world, to himself, and to her. But as the paramedics lifted them onto stretchers, the reality of their fragility pressed down once more, wounds both seen and unseen, lives hanging by a thread, but the bond forged in fire and bullets unbreakable. Elara's hand found his again on the stretcher, a lifeline, a tether that kept them anchored to hope, to love, to the future. And in that brief, stolen moment of quiet amid sirens and panic, the world seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the power of what had been born from chaos, not destruction, but love, resilience, and the fierce protection of those who would never be broken again. As the ambulance doors closed, a doctor's voice cut sharply through the haze. She's pregnant. Ilara's eyes widened in shock. Lorenzo's hands trembled over hers, and the world outside disappeared, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful weight of the life they had unknowingly created. Snow fell softly over the Volkov estate, blanketing the stone terraces and marble fountains in a hush that felt almost holy. Months had passed since that bloody night, and the world seemed to exhale again. The scars on Lorenzo's body had healed, but the ones inside him had left their quiet reminders, reminders of pain, love, and the choices that had rewritten his destiny. Each morning he awoke to the faint laughter of Sophia and the cooing of baby Luca, and each time his gaze fell upon Ilara, painting quietly by the frost-kissed window, he was reminded that salvation sometimes wore the face of a stranger. The man once called the Wolf of Vienna now walked through his halls, not with the weight of empire on his shoulders, but with the fragile heartbeat of peace in his chest. His cane clicked lightly on the marble floor as he passed through the corridors of his reborn world, a world no longer fueled by fear, but by loyalty and something far rarer, love. Ilara sat in the garden wrapped in a soft wool shawl, her brush gliding across the canvas as the morning sun broke through the clouds. She painted not from darkness now, but from hope, strokes of gold and white, the way light danced over the snow, the way Sophia's tiny footprints curved beside Luca's. Her belly, rounded with new life, caught the light beneath her coat. Every so often, her hand would rest there protectively, and she'd smile, that soft, trembling smile that had once disarmed the wolf himself. Nearby, Sophia helped Luca build a snowman, her cheeks flushed pink, her laughter echoing across the courtyard like bells. Matteo stood at a distance near the iron gates, coat collar raised, eyes scanning the horizon as he always did. Even peace, he believed, must be guarded like a secret. But when his gaze wandered to the family inside the garden, something almost like contentment flickered across his hardened features. Inside the mansion, the halls that once smelled of gunpowder and cigars now carried the scent of pine and baked bread. Christmas decorations hung from banisters and chandeliers. Sophia had insisted on helping, placing golden ribbons on every door. In the main hall, a grand tree stood glowing with warm lights, its ornaments reflecting fragments of the past and hints of a gentler future. Lorenzo paused before it, his reflection staring back at him from a crimson bauble. The man he once was, cold, calculating, unyielding, felt like a ghost he no longer recognized. He had bled for vengeance, lost for power, and killed for survival, but none of it had given him the peace that now lay quietly within reach. Ilara had not only saved his daughter, she had saved the man Sophia would one day call her father without fear. That evening, the estate glowed with warmth. Snowflakes drifted lazily against the window panes, and the sound of a piano filled the air, Sophia playing a song she'd learned for her papa. Ilara hummed softly beside her, painting one last canvas for the year, a portrait of them all together beneath a snowy sky. Lorenzo stood by the fireplace, watching the flames dance, his hand resting on the mantel beside an old photograph of Isabella. The ache of her memory was no longer sharp. It was something softer now, a quiet gratitude for what she had once been to him. He looked from her photo to Ilara, and for the first time, he understood that love doesn't replace what's lost. It rebuilds what was broken. Later that night, as the clock neared midnight, the first fireworks cracked through the sky above Vienna, their colors bleeding across the snow. Ilara stepped out onto the balcony, her breath forming tiny clouds as she gazed upward, eyes sparkling with reflection. Lorenzo followed behind her, his coat draped over her shoulders before she even shivered. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his, eyes that had once held nothing but defiance and fear, now full of unspoken promises. "You've given me something I thought I'd never have again," she whispered. "A home." Lorenzo smiled faintly, his voice low, roughened by emotion. "You didn't just find a home, cara mia. You built one here. In me." He really ached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Under the soft snow and the glimmer of distant city lights, Lorenzo knelt before her. The man feared by empires, the wolf whose name once silenced entire rooms, lowered himself in surrender before love. The diamond in the ring caught the reflection of the fireworks above, casting tiny sparks across the snow between them. Alara gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes as her hands flew to her lips. "Alara," he began, voice barely a whisper, "you walked into my storm and brought me peace. You saved my daughter, my soul, and the man I thought was lost forever. Will you stay with me, as my wife, as my dawn?" Her tears spilled over, glistening on her cheeks like melted snow. She nodded, trembling. "Yes, Lorenzo, 1,000 times yes." Sophia squealed from behind the door where she had been peeking, running into their arms just as Alara laughed through her tears. Luca gurgled in Matteo's arms nearby, clapping his tiny hands as if sensing the joy around him. The ring slipped perfectly onto Alara's finger, glittering in the light of the fireworks exploding above. Lorenzo pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers, and for a moment the entire world seemed to disappear. No blood, no betrayal, no empire, just the sound of snow falling and hearts finally at peace. The wolf had found his home not in walls or wealth, but in the arms of the woman who had walked into his life from the cold and turned his winter into spring. Inside, the fireplace crackled. Sophia danced around them, singing softly, her voice mingling with the faint church bells from the city below. Matteo lingered by the window, a rare smile crossing his face as he poured himself a drink, raising it quietly toward the couple. Peace, it seemed, had finally found them all. Lorenzo lifted Ara's hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "Merry Christmas, amore mio," he murmured. "To new beginnings." She leaned into him, whispering back, "To love that survived the storm." Outside, the night deepened. The last firework faded into silence, and for a moment, all was still, the estate glowing like a beacon against the snowy hills. But far beyond the gates, in the shadows near the frozen road, a lone figure stood beneath the dim streetlight. His coat collar was high, his breath fogging the air. In his gloved hand, he flipped a silver coin, over and over, the engraved name catching the faint light. Isabella. A smile, thin and dangerous, curved his lips as the coin clicked against his fingers one last time. The faint jingle of metal echoed into the distance as he turned toward the darkness, whispering to no one but the night itself. "The wolf may think the past is buried," the shadow murmured, pocketing the coin. "But ghosts never sleep." And as the snow fell heavier over Vienna, inside the estate, Alara laughed in Lorenzo's arms, unaware that the peace they had built was being watched by eyes that remembered everything.